right, let's go ahead and get started. We'll go through some housekeeping things first, so as more people sign on, they won't miss anything yet. But we have a really exciting presentation for you all today. This is our Environmental Compliance Ask the Experts panel discussion. So we have 4 panelists who have graciously lent us their time today, and they are representing perspectives from leading experts in data collection, testing, consulting, and even producers. And they're going to answer your individual questions about regulations, standards, and compliance. So let's jump right in so that we have as much time for questions as possible. Randy, if you'll go to the next slide. I want to quickly go over some housekeeping and logistics. First, let me introduce myself. I am Amy Groughton. I am the Senior Marketing Manager for GreenSoft Technology. And since today's session is all about answering your questions, the way you can submit your questions is through the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. And you can address your questions to a specific speaker if you want. Otherwise, I'll just read it out to the entire panel. And all of you are on mute, so you're going to have to go ahead and type your questions into that Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. And also, I should mention this webinar is being recorded. So I will send you a link to the recording and a copy of the webinar slides once the event is over. So keep a lookout for that in your inbox. Okay, and now let's go ahead and introduce our speakers. So first, we have Geoffrey Bock, the Business Development and Sales Manager with TUV Rheinland of North America. And we also have with us Michael Kirschner, the President of Design Chain Associates. And on our next slide, we have Mark Frimann, the Product Compliance Manager for Wolfspeed, and also Randy Flinders, the Compliance Specialist for GreenSoft Technology. All right, so each of our speakers has prepared just a few short slides to tell you about themselves and their backgrounds and their companies, and also give you some ideas about the kind of questions that they can answer for you. So let's jump right in with Jeff.
Hello, everyone. My name is Geoffrey Bock. I work with TUV Rheinland, and I've been with the company for 21 years now. We do a lot of testing, certification, inspections for global markets for all types of products and systems. As you can see, industrial services and cybersecurity would be one of our business streams. Mobility is one of our larger business streams. Products, of which I work for sales under products, we include soft lines, which could be toys and textiles. Hard lines is typically furniture, silverware, flatware, exercise machines, and many other household items. Electrical, which could be anything from a coffee machine or a cell phone to tabletop instruments in the industry that require, like laboratory equipment, for example. Solar and commercial products, here we're talking robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, solar products, industrial machinery, and then medical devices, all types of testing for medical devices. We also have a business stream for academy and life care, and systems. We certify management systems, for example, ISO 9001, 14001, 13485 for medical. We also do aerospace and many others, in the automotive industry as well. So we have many locations that have chemical testing labs. We're in about 67, 68 different countries around the world. Chemical testing labs is what you're going to see here, but we're in many more locations around the world with many other types of testing laboratories. Here in North America, we have since 2010 a chemical lab in Bentonville, Arkansas. We are expanding, and next year we will triple our capacity, triple our capabilities as well, and the personnel. As you can see, we're in Europe, Asia, India, and Bentonville covers both North and South America. Okay, next slide. So what we do at TUV Rheinland for the chemical lab, especially for environmental product compliance, in addition to what we do for soft lines like toys, textiles, and hardline stuff, we focus a lot on RoHS using the IEC 62321 dash standards. We're accredited for that by ISO, by A2LA for ISO 17025. We also assist with China RoHS. As you know, it's different, requires a declaration. It requires it to be translated into simplified Chinese. We also give labeling guidelines based on the results because there's two different types of labels. We also assist with United Arab Emirates or KSA RoHS, SASO. Right now, the United Kingdom, for example, is different, and there's some notified body and registration requirements as well. REACH, we're currently at 224 substances of very high concern. And as you know, REACH applies to almost everything that enters the EU, whether it's electrical or not, unless it's something natural in the environment, such as sand or water. CalProp 65, we do basic testing on CalProp 65. You have to remember that there are lawsuits, litigation, what they call court settlements. And the court settlements usually talk about specific substances. We'll talk about that later. But these are the main categories of chemicals that we could test for, because CalProp 65 is based on daily exposure rate. You're not always going to get the right answer through chemical testing. We do the WE directive where we actually break down the equipment. We look for the compliance to the annexes of the directive. If it's labeled correctly, recycling and recovery rate calculations, we will do all that work for you. EU MDR, which is new for chemical substances, for those materials considered invasive to the patient. I also have a white paper out there on the web somewhere, and this talks about Annex 1, Chapter 2, talking about the CLP, or the classification and labeling of packaging for chemical substances. And any more information on that, we'd be happy to answer questions. We do packaging. We also do the POP, which includes PFOS, PFOA, SCCP, which is short chain chlorinated paraffins, and flame retardants. And then we can do custom types of testing for different types of markets. Retail, for example, there's a lot of TSCA testing and requirements going on now. So thank you.
All right, next we have Michael Kirschner.
Yes, hello, I'm Mike Kirschner with Design Chain Associates, and we're a manufacturing consulting firm focused primarily on manufacturers of discrete fabricated articles and complex objects in REACH speak. So a lot of our clients are in the electronics world. We work with apparel manufacturers, we work with medical device manufacturers, all kinds of other types and other markets, based in San Francisco. And we primarily help companies understand and ensure that their products and internal systems ensure their products comply with environmental, regulatory, and customer, and even internal requirements for environmental and sustainable issues like substance restrictions and disclosure, circular economy, recycling, green claims, energy efficiency, conflict minerals, which isn't entirely environmental, it's primarily a social responsibility regulation. And we also help them understand and deal with NGOs and retailer requirements. We have a worldwide scope and work with manufacturers anywhere within the supply chain, as well as their suppliers, and even in some cases their customers. So you can learn more at the dca.llc website. My background personally, since I'm a consultant, that matters. I've worked in, I am an electronics engineer. I have 20 years of experience in large and small manufacturing companies. These you may have heard of. United Technologies, which was recently acquired by Raytheon, Intergraph, back when they used to actually make computers that ran their CAD software, Intel, Tandem, and which was then acquired by Compaq, which was then acquired by Hewlett Packard. But I left before they were acquired by HP and began DCA. I've spent the last 20 years primarily with DCA, but I also worked for a few years for Environ until they were acquired by Ramboll, large Danish engineering and consulting firm. I'm co-moderator right now of the ANSI Chemicals Network, which is kind of on the shelf. In the past, I was a member of the California EPA's Department of Toxic Substance Control Green Ribbon Science Panel. And the purpose of that panel was to help DTSC develop what became the Safer Consumer Products Regulation, which has had a very long and slow launch, it seems. After that, I became a member of the American Chemical Society Green Chemistry Institute Advisory Board, and I just termed off of that last year. So that leaves me a little more time now to work for you. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Yes, my name is Mark Frimann. I currently work for Wolfspeed. I was at Texas Instruments for 30 years and tried to retire, did some remodeling on houses and that kind of stuff, and got convinced I need to come back. So I'm at Wolfspeed now, and Wolfspeed is a semiconductor company as well. It's about 30 years old. It was under the Cree label, and it became Cree Wolfspeed, and now we're just simply Wolfspeed. And so, pretty exciting company to work for, based out of Durham, North Carolina. Yeah, we've got some global footprint, and we've got around 3,500 employees. We just opened up a new fab up in New York, so that's going to expand our capabilities quite a bit. Go ahead and go to the next slide. There we go. And what we do, silicon carbide, instead of the sand or silicon, the company did all the research, things like that, and started silicon carbide. And so it's all about energy efficiency, switching times, and things like that. And again, thermal performance, things like that, so that improve the capability of these products to be smaller, faster, and less cost, of course. And so that's what we've been working on in Wolfspeed. Go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You guys can read it later. But we're in aerospace, automotive, renewable energy, batteries, car batteries, and car systems. Battery systems is a big one we're at in the automotive world. But we're also discovering a lot of other places that you can use silicon carbide. So great place to work. Thoroughly enjoyed it over the last year plus, and it'll be fun to see what happens in the future here.
All right, these are just a few topics to, if some people need ideas about what type of things you could ask here. But we already have quite a few questions, so let's go ahead and move on to Randy.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Randy Flinders, and I'm a compliance specialist here at GreenSoft Technology. And you know, earlier in the slides is a little bit about me and my bio, so I'm not gonna read that to you, but I think most of you might already know me. But in any case, a little bit about GreenSoft for those who don't know us. So we've been around about 20 years, and GreenSoft is considered a leader in the field of environmental compliance management. It's basically two companies. It's a data management services company. So we'll go out to the supply chain, collect all kinds of information on the parts and materials you're using to build your products, information on substance content, legal declarations of compliance to various regulations, and we'll aggregate all that data and provide it to you after we've validated it and made sure that it's accurate and that it meets the requirements of all the various regulations that you're addressing. We also produce software tools that allow you to take that information and do detailed reporting and analysis on your products, make SCIP submissions directly to the SCIP portal and those kind of things. So we're really a solution provider. We're providing a solution that involves both the software and the data. Now, we're a true global company, but we're a database-centric solution provider. So we're not a portal company. So this isn't something where We just give you a website, a web tool, you load your suppliers in there, and then that thing just sends emails out and you hope to get back the data you need. But rather, our engineers are actually in direct contact with the engineers of your suppliers, so that as we're collecting this data and validating it, we're closing out any kind of accuracy gaps or any missing data and making sure that the data is valid and complete and accurate before it's delivered to you, rather than a portal that's just going to accept whatever PDF someone loads and flag it as complete. So we were able to provide kind of an elevated level of service compared to one of those automated portal systems. Right? Now, GreenSoft does provide different levels of service, anything from if you're just a small startup, you can give us your bill of material, we'll go and collect the data, produce the compliance reports, make the submissions, and give you everything you need. Or if you're a large, global corporation, we can set up a global system where you have global access to a global database of all your compliance and substance information that you can share across multiple business units and divisions. And then we can support anything in between that, right? GreenSoft is ISO 9001 certified for data quality, ISO 27001 certified for data security. We're a true global company with offices in North America, Europe, Israel, and Asia. Just some potential things that are going on I wanted to highlight that you might be interested in discussing today. Just some things that I've been receiving a lot of questions on from my customers. So I thought I'd share some of these initiatives with you just so you're aware of them. Obviously, there's some new RoHS substances that have been proposed to be added to the EU RoHS directive. And there's an official initiative now that's been launched to add those substances, those TBBPA and MCCPs. And it's interesting, especially TBBPA, about what the impact might be to electronics producers when those things come through. So that's kind of an interesting topic. Another one is RoHS exemptions. It's always a hot topic. These critical RoHS exemptions from Pact 22, exemption 6C, 7C, 17A, these are used heavily across the industry, and they've been floating out there under review for years now. And so now that the consultant report is published, where do we stand now on that? That's an interesting discussion to have, right? When are we going to see that? What's the status? There's also a new French decree that adds labeling requirements that apply to electronic equipment. It applies both to consumer and professional use equipment, as well as its packaging. And that's effective beginning in January. And there's a lot of requirements there. And that's an interesting topic as well. So you might be interested in that. As if on the conflict mineral side, we see an expansion to cobalt and mica. We see that with the release of the ERIT form from RMI. And then when we start looking at PFAS, there's actually a proposal in the EU by 5 member states to enact an entire PFAS ban across all PFAS throughout the entire EU. But in the meantime, the EU is doing a lot of different individual restrictions on PFAS compounds. So there's kind of a flurry of activity on PFAS. So I think we'll probably end up having some discussions about that as well. I've also listed some points about SCIP here that people sometimes have misunderstandings about. So if you have any confusion on maybe how to do a once an article concentration calculation on your products, or how to derive the article, material, and mixture category codes, since they're not a direct connection to the tariff codes, how to group products together, and when you can group them, when you can't, what's SCIP referencing versus simplified SCIP notifications. These are all kind of confusing topics. So if you have any questions on those, just drop those in the Q&A as well. And then one other topic that I've been getting a lot of questions on is the UKCA, which becomes mandatory in January, and how you can comply with that as far as the UK RoHS, the UK REACH stuff. And it's a kind of a strange setup because of the treaties and the way that they're set up, where certain requirements apply differently in different parts of the United Kingdom, where Great Britain has some requirements that are not applicable in Northern Ireland. So those are the kind of things where we might be able to clear up some confusion there if anybody has any questions. Okay, so I encourage you to think about these topics, as well as any other topics you might have you want to talk to us about. I think you've seen we have a broad range of perspectives here. You have a panel here that all know each other, and we don't necessarily always agree 100% on every topic. So it gives you a chance to see multiple perspectives on these difficult questions. So don't be afraid to bring them to us. Okay. All right, so at this point, I think it's time to get started and start answering some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple pre-submitted questions that were submitted by email that I will ask first and give you all a chance to submit your questions. You'll also see there's a thumbs up icon underneath the questions that other attendees have submitted. So if you also want to hear their question asked or answered, go ahead and give that a thumbs up, and I can prioritize those questions while I read them out. But let's start with this pre-submitted question. Regulations internationally and federally in the US are on a sharp rise with shorter implementation dates. Do you see this slowing in the future?
Yeah, that might be a good one for Mike. I know that Mike is participating in a lot of different panels. So Mike, did you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I don't see it slowing down, and I don't see the timeframes getting any longer certainly without strong technical rationale from industry. Industry needs to be participating a lot more, I think, in stakeholder consultations, getting their industry associations more focused on dealing with these sort of regulations and government entities that are developing them, because the governments have a point, but they're not the experts in what it takes to actually develop a product, develop its supply chain, bring it into production, and whereas manufacturers understand all that. So to come up with something implementable that actually makes an environmental difference requires at least those two entities working together much more closely than they have in the past. I'm sort of disappointed in the amount of effort the electronics industry and certainly other industries have been willing to put into this, seemingly preferring to allow governments to have their way. And like I said, governments do have the obligation to protect their populations and their property, their land. But there are probably more efficient and more effective ways to do this than we've seen in the past. So I see it continuing. I see it becoming more complex, and I see us needing a lot more input and expertise from industry in the discussion.
Okay, great. This next question kind of feeds into that in terms of what the European Chemicals Agency will do here. But with the current supply chain issues around the globe, do you expect that the EU RoHS exemptions that are due to expire or under review will be extended or allow the industry to have more time to find alternatives?
I could take that one. Yeah, I think that, we have a pretty established process for how the exemption reviews go. Now, we have seen some delays, but, it's a pretty transparent process. And so what we have now, if you look at the example PAC 22, which I think is the group of exemption reviews that matter the most to everybody, because those are the critical ones that are used the most. We're talking about the 6 ABC exemptions. We have the 7A, 7C1. These are the ones that are almost in every single electronic product are claiming these, right? So when you look at these review, we can see that this is an ongoing review, has been going on for a long time. And now we have the consultant report. So we now know what's been recommended. So we know what to expect. Now, will the EU Commission release the final directives exactly how it's recommended in the consultant reports? Maybe, maybe not, but at least we have a really good idea of what they're facing and what they're looking at, right? So we can refer to those reports to understand what we might see in the future. And we also know that the RoHS directive is going to give us at least 12 months once the decision is made for us to implement that. Now, ideally, they'll give us more time, and that might be the case if critical exemptions are sunsetted. But based on the input from the consultants, we can kind of see that we expect that most of these exemptions will probably be extended, although their scope and applicability might change. So the scope might be narrowed. And so I would recommend going to that consultant reports, the OKO Institute report, and taking a look at what they're recommending the commission do, because that's going to give you an insight into what's coming.
And I'd like to add one thing. I was part of the review of both 7A and 15 exemptions, led the 15 for RoHS this last time around. And what OKO Institute is looking for is valid reasons we can extend it. And if we as an industry don't have valid reasons and can't support that with what have we done to investigate, can we find an alternative? then they're going to be more hard-nosed to say, we don't want this anymore. So we as an industry must be providing data and input, especially on these critical exemptions that we don't have a source for exchanging to something else. So it's important as industry that we're engaged in these things, not hoping something's going to happen and wait and see.
Great. Okay, this next question comes from Robert. Can anyone on the panel provide details regarding product scope under the new French environmental labeling decree that Randy mentioned?
Well, I guess since I mentioned it, I should probably cover that. So the environmental decree covers a lot of different products. Today, we're talking mostly about electronic products, which I think is what most of us are concerned about here on this event. And when it comes to electronic products, the way that they listed in the regulation is that it's going to apply to all electronic and electrical equipment intended for consumer or professional use. Right? So my interpretation of that is anything used in a home or office environment is going to be subject to these kind of regulations. Once you get it into the industrial realm, like factory environments and things like that, then it's not. So, you know, if you're designing something that's going into data center and an office building, then you're probably going to be in scope for this. If you're designing control equipment for the factory floor, then you're probably not. Now, this requirement actually has a lot of different elements to it. And it's really a labeling requirement. It's not a restriction. So there's nothing to have to worry about taking substances out. It's just a matter of if you have SVHCs present, you're going to have to disclose that on the product. You're going to have to label that. There's some dangerous substances that you need to disclose if present. And then there's also other elements like percentage of recycled materials in the product, the recyclability of the product. And then the packaging has to have things like, you know, is it refillable? Is it reusable? Does it have any compostable material in it? So there's all these different kind of environmental status that you have to provide as part of these labels. But from a scope perspective, when you look at electrical and electronic equipment, it's more than just consumer, it's also professional. And that answers the question. We do have a blog on the GreenSoft website that goes into details of exactly which equipment is in scope and what for example, building materials come into scope and that later than electrical and electronic equipment. So I encourage you to look at the blog to see the the exact list of which products and when they come into scope. From an electronics equipment perspective, though, it's January of this coming year.
All right. Do we as manufacturers have to reach out to our supply chain every year for updated CMRT or REACH SVHC documents, in parentheses, twice per year?
I can take that. REACH, as everyone should know, is published every 6 months with new substances that all of the European Union members have voted upon, right? So they might come out with a list of 20 or 30 substances that they're reviewing. It doesn't mean all of those are going to be voted upon. Sometimes it could be 2, sometimes it could be 4 or 6 or 8 or 12. And you really never know until the vote is finished. So that could be typically every June and every December. It's been sometimes a little bit late in the past 2 years, but for the most part, REACH you have to do every 6 months, and you're going to get 6 month time after the publishing to for the new substances that show up to see if you comply with that or not, or if you have to do something on the SCIP database, or your products or your articles are below 0.1% weight by weight. For all the other compliance issues, there's various things that you want to do for RoHS or WE or REACH or POP. If something changes, such as a design change, and you have new materials, or maybe you have a new supplier of original material, you need to do that immediately. The supply chain should be refreshed at a minimum every year. What I think is what I believe, because so much happens in the supply chain. So refreshing data and using, whichever way that you're going to prove your compliance, there should be a mix of data collection. There should be a mix of high-risk testing of materials or suppliers, depending on how you've done your risk assessment. And if anything changes, obviously you're going to want to refresh that data. Anyone else want to support that?
Yeah.
I agree 100% with what you said, Jeff. And, you know, just a point you made there about how a lot of times people think of, you know, my compliance program, do I want to do data collection or do I want to do testing? And that's really not the way to look at it, because a comprehensive compliance program involves both data collection and testing. In order to do the risk analysis to figure out which parts are at highest risk and which suppliers are at highest risk, as described under IEC 63000, you need to collect data. You need to interact with those suppliers first. You need to figure out where they are in the status. Once you've evaluated that risk, then you need to go validate their data. You need to do more than just collect a statement that says, hey, I'm compliant with these regulations. That's not good enough, right? That's typically not going to be acceptable if you're ever audited. So what you need to do is have a risk analysis program in place, and that involves constant communication with your supply chain. So simply collecting data once and then assuming that's good for 2 or 3 years, that's not going to look very good if anybody ever calls you out to show that you can prove your compliance. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, let me follow up on these comments regarding CMRTs. Technically, that's a once a year project, because if you're a publicly held manufacturer, you have to submit a Form SD to the SEC by May 31st of each year, and you have to do your due diligence collecting CMRTs from your supply base for your products at least annually to complete that. There are changes in the smelter list in terms of previously conformant smelters and refiners becoming non-conformant. For instance, a number of Russian refiners were listed as non-conformant due to sanctions in March. So the supply chain needs to be working on that after that happens, so that in your CMRT for calendar 2022, you don't want to see those refiners in your supply base. So it is an annual process, but it's not necessarily just a once a year thing. Like Randy said, for that process as well, you do want to stay in touch with your supply base and ensure that the smelters and refiners upstream are not including ones you don't want to see in your supply base. That's becoming more and more challenging. And REACH is interesting, as Jeff said. Every 6 months, the SVHC list changes, but there's also Annex 17 of restricted substances, and that's not on a schedule. So you do have to keep your finger on that pulse as well to see whether substances are on the way to being restricted, or if the scope of the restriction encompasses your products as well. And regarding SVHCs, right now there is an open consultation period for 9 substances that are on the registry of intentions. So a couple of those might be interesting to electronics manufacturers like TBBPA, for instance. So that may become an SVHC in the December timeframe. So keep your eye on that as well.
Yeah, and there's a link to make comments in the blog published about that on GreenSoft's website as well. So if you want to participate in that consultation period, there's a link on our blog. All right, next question comes from Brian. And just a reminder to the audience, I am prioritizing these questions based on your votes. So keep the questions and the votes coming. So Brian asks, we are a manufacturing company within the US. To our understanding, only EU producers, assemblers, importers, and distributors need to submit to the SCIP database. We do not directly sell our products into the EU, but we have had customers requesting product substance information on the SCIP database. Can you clarify our responsibilities within the scope of SCIP?
Yes, I can. I'll take it first.
Right.
You can correct me when I'm wrong, man. The importer in that case is responsible for entering the data into SCIP. You have to provide that information to them so they can enter it. And if you have an authorized representative, they may be responsible for it rather than the importer. But typically, in your situation, if it's just a U.S. company shipping product over to customers in the EU, it's the importer who has the obligation. So yeah, you are responsible ultimately for providing that information, if not directly entering it yourself into the database.
Okay. Cindy asks, for the UKCA mark, is a UK-based authorized representative mandatory for non-EU or UK-based manufacturers? Can our distributor, who is in the EU but not UK, be our UK authorized representative?
I guess I'll take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the answer is you're required to have a UK representative to support the UKCA mark. Right? Basically, someone inside the UK has to take legal responsibility for the declaration of conformity that you're issuing. So there's a transition period where they're accepting, submissions with authorized representatives in the EU, but that's ending. So you want to make sure that you transition to an authorized representative. If you're issuing a UKCA declaration of conformity, it must list the UK entity that's taken responsible on the declaration of conformity itself. So if you don't have an office in the UK that can do that, then you're going to need to have an authorized representative in the UK represent you there, just like you do in the EU.
All right. Has the CMRT become disconnected from the original US Dodd Frank Act? And if so, who owns this social responsibility scope?
Well, the CMRT was never a government document. It was created by a third party, the EICC, which is an industry association, and they still own it. It's called the Responsible Minerals Initiative now, RMI. So it is still the best way to do the required upstream due diligence, though, to provide information on the 3 TGs, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, to the federal government. But RMI is expanding the scope of their I guess the metals and materials that they're looking at upstream. They've issued the EMRT for mica and cobalt so far, but they're also looking at all kinds of other materials like aluminum, copper, lithium, and so on.
And they're not restricting it to the Congo either.
Right.
Yeah. Just to add to that comment a little bit, though, that the CMRD form is designed to support the U.S. conflict minerals requirements. So in that sense, it hasn't deviated from that at all. That is still the preferred vehicle, and it's tied to a standard called IPC 1755, right, where there's a committee on the IPC standards committee that they meet and they work to put together kind of the schema that would be used by the CMRT, and then RMI coordinates with that committee. So they really are tied to reviewing and making sure that it supports the U.S. requirements.
All right. What do you know about the status of the US PIP restriction and the proposed US PFAS reporting rule?
Well, I can talk to the PIP restriction. That is currently slated to come into force on October 31st, 2024. However, the EPA also says they're going to review it as well as the other Section 6H PBTs that were banned or restricted in 2021. So that one's still a bit up in the air, but it's effectively going to be, restricted or banned. Just the timeline is unclear. Maybe somebody else wants to talk about the PFAS, the whole PFAS reporting rule.
Well, I guess I could talk about that, or I don't know, Jeff, I think you guys are doing some PFAS testing. Did you want to take that one?
They are doing the testing, PFOS, PFOA, PFAS. There's a lot of new development on testing methods and validating those tested methods. We do some basic, you know, they talk about salts, they talk about, you know, different types of PFOS, PFOA. And then there's different regulations with different requirements. So there are screening methods to be used that cover a lot so that you can say, do I have this in my product at all? It wasn't intended to be there. Is it there? Yeah, we can test for that. Some of the ones getting down to the nitty gritty, because there's so many different types. It's very hard to get down and say, well, you have this one, and that's how much is in it. That becomes very difficult. So it requires supply chain declarations and formulas, which are hard to do when you're talking about proprietary substances, coatings, and that type of thing. So we hope that the PFOA, PFOS, that gets a little bit easier, right? So if you mention something in the European Union where they may ban all types, that's simple, right? You do a basic screening of that type, and you can find out if you have it in your product at all. And if it is, it's no good. Whereas if you're looking for a specific type, that becomes much more difficult and a lot more work for the chemical labs to define and develop those validated test methods. But it's coming, and we're ready. We're doing the testing now globally, but there is different types for different types of capabilities for different labs, and we're hoping to get that taken care of soon.
Just to add to that a little bit, when we talk about EPA and PFAS, there's a lot of activity there, but it's kind of all over the place. So they have their strategic roadmap for PFAS, where they've promised to shorten the time period to get that resolved. They have, like I think that when you talk about the reporting requirements, you're talking about the Section 8 record keeping and disclosure requirements, which is basically just them collecting information, which they're going to use then to make more restrictions. In the meantime, they've proposed adding PFAS, certain PFAS to the what they call that the super fund. Or they call that the anyway. So basically, what that means is that they can force you to clean it up if you make a pollution mistake. And so they're taking all these different sideways actions, but really they don't have the work done yet to tell us, okay, these are the PFAS compounds we're going to restrict. These are the ones that you're not allowed to use. We haven't gotten to that point with EPA yet. They're working on that, and their approach has been they're looking at perhaps following the OECD approach, where they say, okay, well, should we be restricting these by groupings, like, short chain versus long chain, or, PFCAs or what? So there's a lot of unknowns with the US requirements right now. And it's the same with EU. We have probably half a dozen initiatives in the EU that are competing with each other right now for PFAS. So when it comes to PFAS, it's a really still there's a lack of clarity industry-wide there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there is the main regulation. There's a regulation in the state of Maine that requires reporting on what PFAS substances are in your product, starting at the beginning of the year. And that one's, I'm not sure how they plan to enforce that, because I'm not sure how big a market Maine is actually for anybody. But the requirement is kind of something that I would think the EPA would ultimately preempt, because the EPA, per the Defense Authorization Act, I think of 2020, has to obtain information on which PFAS substances are used in which products going back 10 years. So nobody has records of that. I just can't imagine that many commercial manufacturers are going to have that sort of information. So it's still unclear to me how they are implementing that requirement, but supposed to be implemented as of the beginning of the year. Maybe I just haven't been paying attention to it, but that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Okay, next question comes from Fred. As a manufacturer, I feel like we are always playing catch up with REACH updates. Is there a way that we can get ahead of this? And also note that we use a lot of proprietary plastics that make it impossible to report on the chemical level.
So as I mentioned earlier, you never really know which one they're going to vote upon. There is a long list. I think there's thousands that they're reviewing, and the new ones come on board every month to review. The review process can be long. The actual voting process is every 6 months. If they're looking at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 substances and there are only 2, I think this last one, there was 1, 223 to 224. So not everybody's in agreement. And all European countries have to vote. And so you really don't know which ones. You can get ahead of it. You can look at the list and say, yeah, let's check for all of these. Maybe or maybe not be voted upon. And it might be years until they're voted upon. So that's really difficult to foresee, in my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, I think your only option is bring on a toxicologist and use Article 57 to make the determination of whether any of the substances in your product meet those requirements, and that's extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's like Jeff said, I don't think there's a good way to do that except keep your eye on the registry of intentions.
All right, Daniel is asking an interesting question about the future of labeling. He says the number of mandatory markings on labels are increasing and it's becoming challenging to fit all of the required markings on a single label. So A, does the panel foresee an increase in mandatory markings being required in the future? And B, has there been any conversation about migrating some of the markings to a digital landing page using a bar or QR code?
That's a great question. I like questions like that because we just heard about Randy talking about the French decree. We have the WE label, right? We have other industry labels. We have safety labels. We have eco labels. And now we're going to put another one directly for France on there. If another country comes up and says, we want to do that too, now we got 2 plus the WE symbol for all of European Union. I mean, at one point, they're going to have to agree on something. I think a QR code is a brilliant idea. TUV Rheinland has test marks, for example, with a QR code on it, and then you can bring it up on a mobile device or on your PC, and you can say, wow, these are all the things that TUV Rheinland has done for this product, for example, right? There are other QR codes as well, but to have something centralized where you can list out everything is a good idea in this digital world. However, some countries, they want it physically on the packaging or physically on the product. If it doesn't fit on the product, then it has to go on the packaging. If it doesn't fit on the product and packaging, it has to go into the instructions.
Yeah, just one more comment on that is some of my larger customers, big global companies, have been forced to have different SKUs for different regions for that exact reason, is that they need a separate label for Europe and Asia because they just don't have enough room on their tiny little electronic product to cover all the global marks. And so they'll actually apply that when they ship it out, they'll apply the regulatory label and it'll relate to whatever market they're shipping to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of distressing. Just a couple of points. There's another packaging label from Italy as well. So Jeff, we've got more. And I think a big reason for that, for France and Italy and others thinking about it in Europe, is the fact that the packaging directive is way past its due date for a recast.
Yeah.
So hopefully when the packaging recast happens, that'll preempt some of these, at least the packaging related labeling requirements. As far as having them be virtual or on a screen, certain markets allow that. in some cases for products that do have screens. For instance, on a monitor, you can have the China Ross logo pop up on it instead of labeling.
That's right.
Labeling the product.
That's right.
But most markets still don't let you do that, even if your product contains some sort of monitor or is a monitor.
Right.
Great. Okay, time is flying by. So I think we have time for one last question, and then we can wrap up. As someone who is still relatively new to the product compliance role and the world itself, what is the best way to stay up to date with all the latest news and information on all the different regulations? This is actually the most upvoted question we've had as well. So I think a lot of people are interested in hearing your answers here.
So
I think Mark's a good one for that.
let me start it, and then I'll let the other guys jump in. So probably the best, and this is strictly for electronics, is using the IEC 62474 database. It was once upon a time called the JIG 101 Joint Industry Guide. And what this group of people, and I was and am a part of that, is looking at worldwide regulations on restricted substances and if they apply to electronics, then it gets added to the list. So even within REACH, not every REACH substance is an electronic concern, but if it possibly could be, not that it is, but possibly could be, then it's added to the list. So I would start there, and that way, and this panel of people are worldwide. We have Japanese, Korean, Chinese, all over Europe, US based, Latin America. So we've got a global look at requirements coming out. So it's a good place to start. And there is stay engaged with standards. And somebody else asked, well, how do I get involved? What's the advantage of being a part of standards? One of those reasons is you get to rub shoulders with people that like you all up and down the supply chain and on a global basis even. So that, again, I never heard about that. So what's going on there? You get this back and forth communication going on and a respect for one another that you can use this to say, okay, I now need to go and check on this myself. Or, hey, this is what I know about this. So it's another advantage of being on standards is this group of people that are really experts in the field that they have to work with and the products they deal with. And I'm a component person. I'm not a materials guy, but I use materials all the time. I'm not an OEM. So I need to be working with OEMs, material suppliers, and everybody else in between so that I can get a good, wholesome view of what are the requirements and how do we go about making sense of the requirements and then saying, how can we meet the requirements? And again, that's what standards are about.
Great.
Yeah, I second Mark's statement. I myself participate in a lot of the standards committees. In fact, Mark and I have been on a lot of committees together, and it really is an excellent resource because every single regulation that comes up, these material declaration standards, they have to address those, and so those are brought to the committee. So if you're on the committee, you're automatically getting these kind of things coming to you. So it's really difficult to miss if you're just using one provider, one kind of information provider. You're not guaranteed they're going to capture everything either. But by participating as an industry participant in industry activities, then you're going to get the umbrella of the whole industry efforts coming to you, right? So I would encourage you to consider, most of these standards committees allow you to participate even as an observer. So for example, IPC 1752 committee, you can be on that committee, you can sit there as an observer. You don't actually even have to be a member of IPC. You can send someone to the meetings and they can hear everything that's going on. So those are the kind of things you can do that give you the kind of information that maybe a lot of people don't have yet.
I'd like to add in, so GreenSoft has a newsletter. Michael Kirschner with Design Chain Associates has a newsletter. TV Rheinland has a newsletter. Get together with some of these organizations, sign up. You're going to get, you won't be overfilled in your inbox, right? Because these come out once every 2 weeks or once a month. I don't know, Mike, how often yours come out?
Not often anymore.
Not
At
often.
this point, I'm too busy.
Yeah. So, those are good places to go as well. So you can get something that maybe you weren't looking at, but all of a sudden it hits you in the face. And like Mark said, that's a very good place to go I remember the Joint Industry Guide, and being a member of the ASTM F40 originally for the declarable substances and materials. I think I was on there for 10 years. That was, once you get a hold of those people and you're constantly working with those people, NSF, IEC, IEEE, for example, EPEAT, Organization for Environmentally Friendly Electronic Equipment. EPEAT is also a very good place because now we're developing standards for electronic equipment that looks at all of these different things as well. These are great organizations that you can join up for a newsletter, and you're going to get a lot of information.
All right. Let me just say two things. First of all, regarding IEC, the particular technical committee to consider joining is TC 111.
Yes.
The different working groups, the different technical advisory groups, tags. Did I get that right?
Yes.
I never get the terminology right. Each country has their own tag. Mark is now the co-chair of the US tag, which is awesome. Congratulations, Mark. And this is actually, he's right. I agree with him. I think Randy, you're on it as well. I believe TUV's involved as well. I mean, this is really quite an organization. It's quite a good group to keep your finger on the pulse of. All right. The other thing I wanted to say is that, yeah, we've been talking about materials, but that's not and substances. That's not the only scope of regulatory focus. There's circular economy, there's energy, there's recyclability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So 111 addresses those to an extent, maybe in a best practices sort of way. But to really keep your finger on the pulse of the regulations coming out really requires that you either hire an army of people to keep tabs on every single country that you're marketing into, or there are a couple of companies, maybe more, that have built up databases and keep those databases maintained that you can subscribe to. They're not cheap, but and it's kind of tedious to go through all the regulations to get the information you need specifically for your company. But you know, those are really the best ways to ensure that you're knowledgeable and aware of what's going on in all of your markets.
Okay, great. I think that was the perfect final question to wrap things up with. So I want to sincerely thank each member of our panel for sharing your time with us today. I think we had some really good, interesting discussion, and thank you to all the attendees for joining us. As a reminder, I will be sending the recording and a copy of the slides to each of you in your email. And the slides do contain information on the panelists and their companies if you want to go check out their various websites and such as well. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
I'll say one more thing before we go. I just want to add that if you have any more questions on the answers we've given, that these slides have our contact information. So just send us an email. We can continue that conversation with you directly. And if we didn't have time to answer your question, feel free to send it to us. Like I said, our contact information is in the slides. You could send it to all four of us. You can send it to one of us, and we'll be happy to answer your question. So I apologize if we didn't get to your question today, but don't be shy. You can go ahead and send that to us.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.